la famille.
First of all, thank you for coming, guys. I know this is a late night. This is when I do my writing, so I figured I would invite you into my process, since that's why I came to Paris. I've only really spent proper time in Paris during this trip. The last time I was here, I couldn't afford a real meal. I couldn't buy a good bottle of wine. It was a long, long time ago, and it actually wasn't that long ago. I mean, when I think about my life's trajectory, it was probably 2002, 2003, 2002. Stayed in hostels, couldn't afford a hotel or an Airbnb, didn't exist at that point. So it's been nice to actually be able to eat lots of bread and chocolate this time. And wine. Oh my God, and my wine took a walk, grew legs, and disappeared. Okay, we'll fix that. So the way that I usually do these, it's very informal, as you've probably already gathered. I don't have anything prepared. There's no speech. Generally speaking, what I'll do, and I don't know what the hard out time is for people who are working here tonight or have been kind enough to actually lend us this space. So the family, first of all, let's give them a nice little thank you. Could not imagine a better spot. I mean, I was going to do this in some park, and I was like, we're going to look like we're doing drug deals. It's going to be super sketchy. And then I was going to do it at some restaurant, and it's like, no, we can only fit 15 people. It's like, oh, God, okay. It's going to be a huge pain in the ass, and this is a perfect environment. So this is fantastic. And generally, the format, let me try to get back to this, is just like a town hall hangout. So what I'll generally do is be on stage. If people have any questions about anything, I'll try to answer, probably make something up. And then take a break every once in a while, and we'll just kind of grab more water, take bathroom breaks, and bullshit and talk. That's the basic idea. So if you guys have, thank you very much, have any questions, we can just kick it off. And if people are shy, I'll just point at someone, and then we'll get started. So in the back? Yeah. And I'll repeat the question. So the question is, I've been advocating slow carb for a long time. Is it compatible with intermittent fasting? Can you combine them? Another common question I get related to that is, you're talking a lot about, as I am, the ketogenic diet. So should I do keto instead of slow carb? And my answer is that for 99 out of 100 people, I recommend standard slow carb, because the good program that you follow is better than the perfect program that you quit. And intermittent fasting, if you look at and I'm not going to name names, but if you look at the people who are best known for promoting intermittent fasting, they tend to use a lot of stimulants, and they use anabolic steroids. Because if you take, for instance, like Dianabol, which is an oral anabolic steroid, it inhibits appetite. Well, that's very useful for intermittent fasting. I do think there is a place for intermittent fasting, but what ends up happening for a lot of people is, because they've fasted for, say, 16 hours, they think they can eat anything they want for 8 hours. That's not how it works, in my experience. And intermittent fasting can be useful. I did that yesterday. I'm fasting today, primarily. I'm fasting tomorrow, for instance. But the reason I recommend slow carb over, for instance, keto is very similar. Ketogenic diet, which is like the Atkins diet, primarily fat-based, it's at least 70% of your calories from fat, generally speaking, has almost no margin for error. What I mean by that is, you're either in keto or you're not. And if you're in keto, or you want to get in keto, you eat 5 too many cashews, you're out. You're out of keto. And what is really not ideal is so if you do slow carb 90%, you can get great results. You do keto 90%, you're going to destroy your lipid profile, and you're going to gain fat, because you'll be dependent on glucose but consuming a lot of fat. That's a big mess. So if you have incredible discipline, can completely control your diet, and probably have OCD, then I would say ketogenic diet. If you have cancer, or epilepsy, ketogenic diet. Otherwise, generally speaking, slow carb diet. Okay. Yeah, of course. Yeah, what do I get out of intermittent fasting? So, I primarily intermittent fast, and just to give it a different label, let's call that skipping breakfast. For me, just to keep it simple, I'm not strictly following, say, the 16 and 8 or the 5 and 2, where people will eat normally for 5 days a week and then intermittent fast for 2. I'm not doing any of that. I find that I write very poorly when I have a lot of food in my stomach. So I wake up here, for instance, and I will meditate and then do some stretches just so I'm not half asleep, and then write or do some type of writing work for 2 to 3 hours with tea and coconut oil. What was that? That is when I do some of my best heavy lifting for book work. Then I will generally have, because I'm waking up late, I'll wake up at, say, right now, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. Which doesn't matter here in Paris because it gets dark at 9:45, which is great. It's so nice. And I'll have a late lunch around like 3 or 4 o'clock. And then I'll have another late dinner at some other point in time. If I want to enjoy desserts, which I have here in Paris, I've had so many fucking croissants and like so much chocolate and so much wine and so many pastries. It's unbelievable. I will intermittent fast also, just to minimize some of the damage. And generally, since I'm having dinner with my family, it's like breakfast, forget it. I'll just have coconut oil and tea. That's fine. And then I'll have a sort of paleo-ish late lunch, and then I'll just go bonkers for dinner. And I'll try to work out before dinner, but it doesn't always happen. Fortunately, Paris is a great walking city, so I'll usually walk for quite a bit before dinner. Answered a lot of questions you didn't ask, but yeah, there you have it. that happens a lot when I start having more of this. Okay. Yeah, in broad strokes, that's a question about updating the 4-hour work week. Like, what would be the most important updates? All right. There are a number of ways I can go about trying to answer this. The plan on some level was to do a 10th anniversary edition of the 4-Hour Workweek, which is insane to think about, but it first came out in April of 2007. So next year, in whatever it is, 9 months or something like that, it's going to be the 10th anniversary, which explains the hair loss partially. But there really is, I think, a losing battle in trying to update a book with technology tools. Because by the time you put it out, it's likely that at least a few things are outdated. Fortunately, I would just underscore that the underlying principles and thinking and questions in the 4-Hour Workweek don't expire. That was very deliberate. The tools do change over time. I think that the biggest updates would be probably testing on Facebook, contextual advertising, as opposed to strictly Google AdWords, which has become, for many people, very expensive. The targeting on Facebook is so specific that it could replace the magazine exercise that I talk about in the 4-Hour Workweek, looking at niche publications. There are very cost-effective ways to test on Facebook at this point in time. But the low-tech options, and I'm not sure who this was, I want to say it was maybe Derek Sivers on the podcast, because that's the book I'm working on right now. It's just an encapsulation of lessons from the podcast guest. It said something like, tell 20 of your friends about your business idea. And if they don't tell more people, don't do the idea. It's like such a simple exercise, but very profoundly effective at weeding out bullshit ideas. Like, if no one's excited to tell your idea or share it with other people, if you're like a bunch of buddies having drinks, like, it's not a good idea. It just isn't. So There are tools, for instance, like Unbounce or Lead Pages. They're very easy ways to create landing pages now that didn't exist when I first wrote the 4-Hour Workweek. But I hope that if I arm people, or that sounds really militant, equip people with the right principles that the people who are going to succeed will find the tools, hopefully. And I'll continue to showcase some of those tools on the blog, for instance, which is just a faster way to iterate and offer that type of thing. For quite a while, and I actually experimented with providing some type of community or a membership platform so that things could be constantly updated. It just became too much of a headache. It just became a huge pain in my ass. So I refunded everybody and stopped. This was a couple of years ago. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I tried a membership platform and I was like, this is a huge pain in my ass. Here's all your money back. I'm done. And I shut it down. Might try it again with Facebook groups. How many people here, actually, let me ask this. If I created or just encouraged people to create Facebook groups for, say, 4-Hour Workweek, principles, tools, etc., in different cities around the world, and there would be one in Paris, for instance. There's already one in London. How many of you would be interested in something like that? Okay, so at least 50%. That's a good number. Now, I mean, in fairness, you've self-selected by coming to a fucking meetup at 1 in the morning, so might not be the best, most reliable sort of standardized data, but there you have it. Okay, questions? How do I spend my time? In choosing projects, something that helps me, it might not help you, but something that helps me is, let's just say I have 10 potential projects. I will go down the list and ask myself which of these projects, if done well, will make all of the rest of them easier or irrelevant. And I constantly ask myself that. I do that with my to-do list also. Like, which of these, if handled properly, will make all of these easier or just go away? And that is a very powerful tool for me in terms of refining focus. The second checkbox that I use, which a lot of my podcast guests also use, like Scott Adams, who created Dilbert, is he calls it systems thinking, but in effect asking myself, like, which of these, if I pursue, like big projects, right? And I tend to think of projects in, like creative projects, in sort of 6-month to 3-year increments. Like if it's a book, no more than 3 years. If it's something shorter, like an audiobook experiment, 6 months. I will ask myself, how much can I gain from this project even if it fails? It's like, which of these projects will give me the most skills, valuable skills, and gain in network even if they fail? Because a lot of projects fail. I mean, you can't predict it. So I'm constantly looking at ways to win even if I lose, if that makes sense, which is what Scott Adams did as well. That's why he kept his job. He had a job at Pac Bell, which probably doesn't mean anything to people here, but it's just like a AT&T. And he kept it for 8 years even after Dilbert was successful because he was able to experiment with this new technology at the time, which was the internet. And he was like, even if I have this other project that's doing very well, this is a very interesting skill set, and I'm getting to meet innovators in this space, so I'm going to keep this job. And if you do that, over time, you win. There's just no way not to win, however you define that. So at least that's what I tell myself. So those are a couple of things that I use personally. And look, I haven't figured, it's not like I have the silver bullet for all of these, right? I mean, like, I fuck up, I do things that are a huge waste of time all the time. Like, it's just, but the good news is, if you're trying to be you want to be financially independent or have options available to you that are attractive, you can mess up 90% of the time. Like, you don't have to bat 1,000 at all. I mean, like Babe Ruth, home run record, strikeout record also. People forget that part. And I don't want to fetishize or romanticize failure. I think that all things being equal, or in general, like, you don't want to fail. Like, that seems obvious. But like in Silicon Valley, like, it's fail fast, fail forward. Like, no. Like, in general, you want to win. Like, let's just be clear here. Like, no. Like, failure is not the objective. So that being said, if you have this, how can I win even if I lose? And you pick your projects in those ways, over time, you will cumulatively end up with what you want. Whether that's what you need is a whole separate question. But yeah, you'll generally get what you want. Okay, other questions. Let's go here. All right, this is a good question. So the question is roughly, how do you achieve being both organized but creative? Because they seem like they would be very different things. So in my experience, if we are defining creativity, which is a very sticky, slippery thing, if we assume that creativity needs space for free association and crazy ideas, I don't think that that is hindered by structure. In fact, I think most people fail to be creative because they don't have constraints, if that sounds strange. But I very firmly believe that. For instance, if you want to be creative in your writing, you can apply some limitations, right? So if you make a list of your favorite words, maybe it's pretty, maybe it's very, maybe it's incredible, and you set a rule. For today, when I journal for an hour, I can't use that. I can't use any of these words. That will make you more creative. It will force your brain to work in ways that it normally doesn't work, which I would view as creative. So for me, I'll give you an example. A few days ago, I had a lot of things scheduled for a given day. So I knew I only had 3 hours to write in the morning. That's it. And I got a lot done. The next day, I had nothing scheduled. It's like, I can wake up late, I can have a cappuccino, I can go for a walk, I can play with my dog. This is great. I have nothing to do. I got no writing done. So I'm not saying that's true for everyone here, but for many people, and in English, there's this, well, I shouldn't say in English, I don't know who the hell quoted it, but in the US probably, because we're obsessed with productivity. But there's a quote which is, if you want something done, give it to a busy man. It's like the person who's busy, who's organized, who has a lot of things scheduled, knows how to get things done. And in my case, when I provide scaffolding, some type of framework in my life that is a schedule, I get more done creatively. There's also a very good book called, I want to say, The Six Thinking Hats by Edward de Bono, D-E space B-O-N-O, which I found very helpful probably 10 or 15 years ago. I still find it helpful, but I haven't read it. So maybe if I read it now, I'd be like, it's not very helpful. But at the time, it was incredibly helpful. Well, what's left on my bucket list? So you said I'm an overachiever. The key to, I think, being an overachiever is hanging out with people who make you feel like you're a lazy bastard. So in Silicon Valley, like, if you look at the people I hang out with, I am a complete loser. Like, I'm not an overachiever at all. So I think the key, in part, to having a good bucket list. Sorry, I just noticed a cat walking around. This is an amazing place. It has cats. All right. So the key to having a great bucket list, I think, is hanging out with people who just think as bigger than you can currently think, right? And sort of the where, choosing your location, I think, is very important for that reason. People tend to neglect the kind of where of happiness and ambition. But to answer your question, what's on my bucket list? I have tons of stuff on my bucket list. I mean, I've never been to, let's see, there are tons of places, the Maldives before they're underwater. I mean, there are all sorts of travel I'd like to go on the Trans-Siberian Express, get on the train in Mongolia and go all the way to Moscow. There's a long list. There's tons of stuff that I want to do. So it's I don't have trouble, and I think in large part because of the people I spend time with coming up with crazy ideas. Yeah, there's plenty left. I'm not. I mean, I don't need fancy. I don't own a car. Like I don't need a fancy car. I'm fortunately at a point where I've realized that doesn't help me. And if you look at a lot of behavior, and I was this way for a long time, I think that many of us spend a lot of time and a lot of energy to do things we don't like, to buy things we don't need, to impress people we don't like. That's terrible. I did that for a long time. And I'm just at a point now, fortunately, where I just don't I give zero fucks. So fortunately, the things that I want to do are not particularly expensive. Like if you look at the things that are on my bucket list, like most of the people here could probably figure out how to afford them. They're not that expensive. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's how I think about these things. I also ask, okay, here's a recommendation. If you have a friend who thinks really big, for a New Year's resolution, have them give you a New Year's resolution and you give them a New Year's resolution. And then you have a bet. That's a really good way to come up with new ideas. Right here. Yeah, so how do you find these sort of out-of-the-box big thinkers? I would say, and I was just reading a transcript from one of my interviews with a guy named Eric Weinstein, who works for Peter Thiel. He's a mathematician. And I asked him this question, basically. I said, like, what if you're in Kansas? You know, what if you're in, like, fill-in-the-blank place? You're not in Silicon Valley. What do you do? And he said, and his answer was along the lines of, find someone who's breaking the rules. Like, find someone, like, in every city, there's someone who's really good at taking street-legal cars and making them extremely high performance and totally illegal. Like, go hang out with that person. You know what I mean? Or, I mean, just somebody who's like brewing up weird shit in their basement that they shouldn't be making. I'm not saying like a meth dealer, so let's be clear. But find people who are thinking outside of the norm, and don't limit yourself to people who are successful in a business capacity, meaning financial. You just need like crazy people who not only think outside of the box, like they don't even know where the box is. Just like completely nutty, very smart people who can ask you good questions. That's all you need, is someone who can ask you really good questions that make you think in ways you're not accustomed to thinking normally, if that makes sense. So I try to, one of the questions I ask a lot of people in any field, like if someone knows a lot about acrobatics, if someone knows a lot about, I don't care, crocheting, they know a lot about volleyball, it doesn't really matter. Like what teacher who is good is controversial in your world? Or like what high performer in your world is controversial and why? And like explore that, and you get all sorts of interesting stuff. That's something that I ask quite a lot. Let's go right here. Yeah, Superman shirt. Okay, well, this is a big, this is a big question. So what makes, broadly speaking, what makes these people happy that I've interviewed? These 200 or so. I guess it's not quite 200, but well, definitely if you include all the books I've interviewed, far in excess of 200. Happy's tough. Success is easier than happy, I think, for type A personalities. Like success. Like stamp, I have a lot of money, I have a nice car, look at all my shit, That is actually, for someone who's just like a bull in a china shop, or like knocking down walls, one of those people, like me, that is easier than actually hitting pause and being like, hold on, breathe, everything's great, stop freaking out, you don't have to get anywhere right now, like take 3 breaths and enjoy where you are. You don't have terrible back pain right now. You don't have an ulcer. No one in your family is dying. Like, chill out. That is actually very, very challenging for type A personalities. So in a way, the people who are most likely to succeed are the least likely to be happy. If we're talking about financially successful. I don't like that term, success, but if we're looking at it in the conventional sense. So what I would say, there's actually a book I'm finishing right now, which I think is great. It's a little long-winded in parts, but I think it's very good, called Joy on Demand, by a guy, I don't know how to pronounce his name, which is embarrassing because I know him pretty well. It's like Chad Mung Tan. He's a Chinese guy who's one of the first engineers at Google. And he created a mindfulness and meditation course at Google, which became the most popular course at Google, which is actually a big deal because they teach hundreds of different classes. And Joy on Demand has very specific exercises that I think are reflected in the interviews I've done with these podcast guests. Because if you look at the most common pattern, or one of the most common patterns, it's some daily meditation or mindfulness practice. At least 80% have that. I would also say weird pattern in males, like 45 and older, a lot of the people I've interviewed don't eat breakfast. Probably like 70%. Very high. Go figure. I don't know what that means, but there you have it. All right. Let's go in the back here. So sleeping recommendations. Yeah, there are a couple. The first is something called the Chili Pad. CHILIPAD, I think it is. It's a small sheet that fits underneath your normal sheet that circulates water at a particular temperature. So Kelly Starrett uses this. Rick Rubin uses this. I have one now because Kelly Starrett bought me one. And it just knocks you out. It's very impressive. The second thing would be a cocktail of sorts, which is not inexplicable, but I don't know the exact biochemical reasons why this works. I was sort of formulated and popularized by a friend of mine who died a couple of years ago named Seth Roberts, PhD, very interesting guy, which is before bed you have, I think I'm getting this right, it's 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, 1 tablespoon of raw honey in hot water. And you just mix it up and you drink it. And I have friends who've had insomnia for 10, 20 years who have said that is the best, most valuable advice they've ever received from me, is that weird little drink. Meditation does help with sleeping a lot, because it depends on the type, but my insomnia, for instance, that I've had, which I don't have right now, I mean I haven't had for a couple of years now, is onset insomnia, where your brain just won't stop. The meditation helps to stop that, or to mitigate it, to minimize it. No. Meditating in the morning will help that. I don't meditate at night. Yeah, some people do, but I do not. Let's go over here. I'll figure out an organized way to do this. I'll probably just sweep this way and then sweep this way. But okay, so how did I decide on writing and advice for choosing your path? Let me dig into that. So what do you mean by, elaborate on what you mean by choosing your path? How do you find things you're good at? Okay. Well, that's a fair question. So, in terms of writing, I didn't want to write. I had a very tough time writing, and I still have a tough time writing. I taught a class at Princeton twice a year in high-tech entrepreneurship on bootstrapping startups, and the students at one point, in effect, asked me, why are you teaching a class of 30 students? Why don't you just write a book and be done with it? And that's a very kind of Princetonian, pompous, asshole way of suggesting something, and I don't think they were totally serious necessarily, but that planted the seed to take this thing that I was doing twice a year and put it into a vehicle that I could just convey to millions of people, as opposed to doing 1 to 30, 1 to 30, 1 to 30. It's like, no, why do that if I can do 1 to thousands, 1 to millions? So that was where that came from. And honestly, I had insomnia because I would get these ideas for book chapter names or sections or whatever would. So I would wake up and I would write it down in this notebook just to get it out of my head so I could go to sleep. And then I ended up with this big stack of notes, and I was like, all right, well, I've got some free time. Why don't I make something of that and like send it to this author I know, Jack Canfield, who's co-creator of Chicken Soup for the Soul, get his advice, and then it just shit went bananas from there. So that's how that happened. Very much unplanned. In terms of figuring out what you're good at, the short answer is you have to try a lot of stuff. Try a lot of stuff. And I think deep down, a lot of us know what we're already good at, and we just don't know how to make use of that. And so I would be your weird self. Like, figure out what makes you uniquely you, and then try to figure out how you can do something with that. I don't know if that is directly actionable and helpful, but that would be my recommendation. Like, it's exhausting and very wasteful to try to be what you think a successful person should be. It's as soon as you start being unapologetically yourself, shit gets a lot easier. If that makes any sense. Now, look, if you're being an asshole, like, you need to probably stop being an asshole. Like, I'm not saying just like anything you want to do is great for you in the world. No, that's not what I'm saying. But there are personality quirks that make people your best friends want to continue to be friends with you, that you can embrace and use in other areas of your life. And most people keep those completely separate to their detriment, I think. If that makes sense. Let's go over here. Okay, how important is my email list and how do I use it in my business? And the broader question is, I think in a way, what do I think of focusing on the list? Okay, so I didn't have an email list, or I didn't use one until like 2 years ago, right? So I'm a little slow. I would say the email is very important because it is the most reliable delivery channel. So I don't have, even though there are some subtleties with ESP and ISPs, that unlike something like Facebook, a friend of mine was talking to someone who runs a multi-million-dollar business based on a Facebook page. And he was asked, what's it like running such a successful business on Facebook? And he said, I feel like I have the most successful McDonald's in the world built on top of a volcano. Because Facebook could change the algorithm at any point in time, and all of a sudden I go from reaching 2 million people to reaching 20,000 people. It's not in your control. Email is more in your control. It's not 100% in your control, but more in your control. My highest I hesitate to say that. So I have a small team of people who work for me. One of the highest priorities for them is building my email list. However, I think this is a very important point. I don't want to build my email lists at all costs. I have criteria for the type of people I want in my email list. And this comes back to sort of first principles, right? We were talking about like the tech tools and so on change, but the principles remain the same. The principle is 1,000 True Fans by Kevin Kelly. That's a great article that you should read if you haven't. And the premise is very simple, which is like, if you choose your 1,000 diehard fans properly, you never have to worry about money or marketing ever again. If you choose those first 1,000 people properly. So for my email list, and this is something also Eric Weinstein, the mathematician, said to me, and not in the podcast. He said this when we were like taking, I think, some type of like sauna or something together. And he said, paraphrasing, but generalized fame is overrated. Right? So being known by like 5 million people may not actually be helpful to you. But if you can choose the 3,000 people who you're famous to, that becomes very interesting. right? Because you could choose, for instance, just the people who attend TED. That's who I want on my email list. And that will dictate the strategy that you use, the type of content you put out, the type of interviews that you say yes or no to. It will dictate all of that. So for me, if you look at, and I know I'm going all over the place, but hopefully this makes some sense. The way that a lot of internet marketers work from a business model standpoint is they create a new program or course of some type once or twice a year. They do a launch process, right? They open cart, close cart. And the most successful of them make probably, if we're talking about that model, they make $10 to $30 million a year. And pre-tax, they give half of that to affiliates, right? So we're talking 5 to 15 million a year. And they have to keep feeding the monster. They have to do that every year. If they stop making money, generally. There are exceptions, like Ramit Sethi, who I've had on the podcast. He's an exception. He's very smart about recurring revenue. I don't want to play that game. I'm just not interested. So for me, I try to attract an audience, and this is how I think about building my list. So that will dictate, for instance, who I retarget on Facebook. Whose lookalike audiences do I want to target? I want to attract people who I can interact with, who will give me opportunities that are not related to selling content or programs. Does that make sense? So that gives me indirect income opportunities like investing in early stage startups. So for those of you who don't know, investing in early stage tech startups, which came from the network and the list, in this case blog traffic, that I developed for the 4-Hour Workweek, will make me probably, knock on wood, at least 10 times what I've made from all of my books from startups. And I've already taken a lot of that off the table. So that came as a direct result of choosing my target for my list and being very deliberate in how I looked at how to thin slice that. But the email list is extremely important to me, but it's not, I'll give you actually, I'm glad you asked this. So this is something I haven't talked about ever. So I was having a conversation, we were with one of my employees, who's kind of like my COO, about landing pages. And he was showing me different landing pages for conversion to 5 Bullet Friday, which is this email I send out every Friday. Has almost a 70% open rate. That's unheard of. That, like, nobody gets 70% open rate. It's insane. So it's very effective. And he's showing me these different landing pages and how they're converting. And he said, well, option 1 is converting by far the best, so we should use option 1. And I looked at option 1, and there were a few things on it that I thought were cheesy. I said, I don't want to use that version because I don't care about getting 1,000 people if there are like 5 billionaires who land on that page and think to themselves, holy shit, this guy looks like a scammer, and they don't sign up. I care a lot about those 5 people. So I will use a page that is less converting across all people just to ensure I have a higher likelihood of getting those 5 people. Because if I develop a relationship with even one of those 5 people, that could give me $100 million. So I don't have to worry about getting another 1,000 people on my list. Does that make sense? So, long ass answer, but I've thought a lot about this because I'm always in my own head. All right, let's go back right there. Yep. So, startups. This term startup is a very tricky term. So when I say that the 4-Hour Workweek doesn't apply to startups, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. So The first point that's very important is that in the last maybe 5 years, the term startup is used for any type of new business. When I use the term startup, I mean a technology startup generally that is taking venture capital investment. Okay. And venture capitalists generally invest in companies that are creating in markets where it's going to be a one-winner race. Does that make sense? In a case like that, you have tremendous time pressure. And you have incredible pressure to spend the money that you have raised to grow as quickly as possible. That is why it is very hard to do something like lifestyle design or the 4-Hour Workweek in that environment. And I've invested in 70 or 80 startups. I mean, I'm very familiar with venture-backed startups, extremely familiar. The principles of being effective doing the right things, as opposed to being just efficient doing things quickly, apply in any type of startup. So the 80-20 principle, Pareto's law, looking at Parkinson's law, how to use deadlines, setting policies so that you're not making repetitive decisions on the same questions, very important. I think 37 Signals is very good at this. And when you look at, for instance, the very most successful venture-backed startups and the absolutely most successful bootstrapped cash flow businesses, they actually have a lot in common. It's in the middle where things get very confusing. But the very, very best, like Uber, right? I was one of the first 3 advisors to Uber before they took any money. I took Uber to get here today. You know, it's just insane. I was probably one of the first 10 people to ever call an Uber. And their model is really, you know, people talk about pivoting, right? We got to pivot. We're going to pivot. We're going to do this. We're going to pivot. We're going to do that. Uber never really pivoted. Like Uber has, in effect, the same model they had since day one. It's a really simple model that makes money. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's nothing fancy or abstract about it. It's a really simple model. And the most effective businesses, like Southwest Airlines, Ryanair, like they have a very clear directive, and all of their decisions go through that directive. Southwest Airlines, we're the lowest cost airline, period. Should we add peanuts? Does it help us to be the lowest cost airline? No. Therefore, no peanuts. It's like, it makes your decision making very, very easy, or simple, I should say. I think Southwest Airlines is a great company to study. Was for decades at least. So best advice for avoiding noise. Email, social media, etc. This is a tough one. It's a very personal question, I think, that requires a personal answer. But for me, there are a few things. The first is blocking out the first 1 to 3 hours of your day to work on your priorities. Very important. So for me, I wake up, if I'm in San Francisco, for instance, I meditate for 20 minutes, which just like chills me out a bit. No text messages. My phone's on airplane mode. I don't take it off of airplane mode until after meditating and after journaling. 20 minutes of meditation. And then I'll set the water for my tea. Then I will sit down and journal, 5-minute journal, which will set my priorities, gratitude, etc. And this gives me sort of a bullet point list that I can come back to throughout the day. And there are tools, right? There are tools. There are tools like email game. There are tools like Boomerang. There are all these things that make you efficient at checking email. But ultimately, you want to be doing the right things. If you're just doing unimportant things quickly, you've already lost, right? It's like you can be amazing at doing unimportant things. You're not going to do 1/10 of what you could do. So for me, I assume that important things will come back to me. This is a belief that is not based on evidence. So, for instance, I have a book to write. I have 6 weeks to complete a book. That's a very short period of time for me. And as a result, I have completely ignored email. I have an autoresponder, just like I talked about in the 4-hour work week, that says, I'm not available. If you have an emergency, do A, B, or C. If this is important, do 1, 2, or 3. I'm not going to see your email. I probably have 2,000 unread email. I've spent less than 2 hours in my inbox in the last month, and I'm going to archive everything. I've started a few things to pay attention to, but I'm going to archive everything. And my belief is, if it's really, really, really important, it's going to surface again. And if I have to choose between being on email 24/7 or missing 1 or 2 great opportunities, I'm going to choose missing 1 or 2 great opportunities, because I believe fundamentally that if you can train yourself to ask uncommon questions and think outside of the box and act outside of the box, there are infinite opportunities for you. You don't have to be beholden to 1 or 2 that you react to that are coming into your inbox, if that makes sense. And that, I'm sure, differs depending on where you are in the trajectory of your career. But even in the early stages, when I was building my company, my first real company in 2000, 2001, these practices were still very important. And another thing I tell myself is, like, all of these incredible icons from like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, no social media. There's no social media. They didn't need to be on fucking Twitter and Facebook. And there are a bunch of people who've been on my podcast, and I'm like, where can people find you on social media? They're like, yeah, I'm not really on social media. Doesn't matter. Like, if you put out really, really good stuff, you don't need to do all of that dancing. You just don't need to do it at all. Is my feeling, at least. You know, like Seth Godin, he's not on Twitter. Like, you have Sebastian Younger, he doesn't do anything on Twitter. Nothing. Josh Waitzkin, 0. Like, none of these people. And there are just like many, many examples. And I think it's important to try to look for the quiet examples. Does that make sense? It's like we're familiar with the people who can't shut the fuck up on Twitter and Facebook. We're like, oh shit, we need to do that because they're the loudest. But it's like, what about the quiet? What about the people you don't hear from? What are the people who are absent? It's a survivorship bias. You don't see it. But in my podcast interviews, it's been great. Every time I come across someone who's not on social media, I'm like, oh, thank you. That makes me feel so much better. Gives me permission to not spend so much time on social. I also will use tools like Buffer or Edgar is another for scheduling posts in advance, so I don't have to think about it. It's like for this month, I recorded, or for June and July, I recorded all my podcasts in advance. And then I organized all of my 5 Bullet Fridays in advance in a Google document. So I didn't have to think about any of that while I was here. I was just writing. That's it. My only priority is writing and enjoying Paris and eating lots of chocolate. Okay. I want to get people who haven't asked questions first. Okay. I do activity/recreation movement more than I do what I would consider exercise. Training, like gymnastics training. Right now, I think I broke my right wrist actually, I had X-rays today. I messed up my right wrist doing some stuff, but typically 2 strength-based workouts a week, and maybe 2 or 3 stretching workouts a week. But I will walk at least an hour a day. I will have some type of motion for at least an hour a day, whether that's walking. Typically, it's walking, swimming, or a combination of walking and swimming. But I will do that every day because that is a form of meditation for me. I'll go fucking insane if I don't do that. I'll go completely bonkers. So, yeah, that's the basic frequency. Hold on. I'll tell you what. Let's go far back, beard and glasses. Polyphasic sleep, I don't have any new thoughts on polyphasic sleep. My main research on polyphasic sleep was in the 4-Hour Body. I don't really have any new thoughts on that. Generally speaking, if you feel like you don't have time to sleep, you don't have your priorities properly defined. So for me, it's like I try to sleep 9 hours a night. And if I am sufficiently focused, I should have no problem doing that, is my feeling. So I may not be the right person to ask. I very rarely polyphasic sleep. Very rarely, but on occasion. Like in an emergency, I will. But polyphasic sleep, as you may know, it takes a while to sort of click in. It's like ketosis times 10. It's a huge pain in the ass. So in general, I feel like if you want to make $1 million a year and you don't currently, ask yourself, if I could only work 2 hours a day, what would I do? And it'll just force you to separate sort of the trivial many from the critical few. Is generally how I would approach it. Okay, so we have, yes, ma'am. Yeah, they're different things. I think they're different things. So I don't think they're too. Actually, I try to repeat this. So she's found a lot of success with visualizing what she wants and sort of going into this daydreaming state of brainstorming possibilities. Like lucid dreaming. But that is a sharp contrast with meditation as it's conventionally thought of, which would be trying to inhibit a lot of thoughts. All right. I think they're separate things. And I don't think you have to choose one or the other. In my case, I use journaling for the exploration of possibilities, and I use meditation for the chill the fuck out, stop talking to yourself for 24 hours a day as you walk around. Non-reactive training, so that I'm not a captive to my emotions in a reactive way. But I use them differently. I mean, hey, you started with, I've gotten everything that I want, so I'd say, keep doing what you're doing. I think that would be my basic advice. All right, right here. A few things. I think that the fears related to artificial intelligence creating massive unemployment are overstated. I think that it's impossible to predict, but it's easy to foresee that artificial intelligence will completely destroy certain industries. And autonomous cars, same thing, like truck driving, right? So in the US, they're like, oh my God, what are we going to do? 5 million people are going to lose their jobs. And then you listen to Mark Andreessen, he's like, every year, 25 million people lose their jobs. This is it's a trivial issue. Like, we solve this every year. So there's that. Translation capabilities with, I think, technology and augmented reality are going to get so good so quickly that we will probably reach a point in the next 5 years, maybe sooner, where you just don't need to learn another language. I hate to say it, but I really think technologically speaking, that we'll get to a point where you have glasses on and someone speaks to you and you just see your native language pop up immediately. I think that is technologically feasible within a year for singular person use. Widespread use, different story altogether. But the technology already exists now where you could have something like Google Glass look at a sign in a foreign language and see the translation pop up immediately for you. Now, that is for basic utilitarian linguistics, right? That's for like finding where you need to go to take a shit. That's if you need to negotiate and understand cultural nuance and idiom, that's a whole different kettle of fish. Okay, so how do I make difficult decisions when I'm going from, say, one field to a completely different field? And how do I think about that? There are a few things that make it easier. The first is I will use the systems thinking that I mentioned earlier, which I think is a terrible term. That's what Scott Adams uses. I encapsulate it in how can I win even if this fails? So when I'm looking at a new project, like should I do tango? Should I focus on Spanish? Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? Should I do that? Which of these, if I attempt it, will help all of the rest, even if it fails? That's a very important question that I constantly ask myself.
But sometimes you don't see exactly what you're going to learn from one experience, so you're not able to...
It's a thought exercise. So I mean, here's the thing. So the interjection was roughly, you can't know, right? I'll just simplify it. You are always operating from a place of incomplete information. If you feel like you have to wait for complete information, you are always going to fail. And therefore, you have to make certain hypotheses and then test them. So step number one would be, which of these do I think will make the rest of these easier or irrelevant, right? The second piece is I will study the people who are the best at what they do and try to identify what they do versus what is being taught. Okay? So whether that's startup investing, like what do the best people actually do? Like yes, they say you should do A, B, C, D, and E. What do they actually do though? If you look at how they invest, how they make decisions, like are they following their own advice? I try to find the discrepancy, the delta between what they say you should do and what they actually do. If I'm looking at, say, tango, right? So I looked at what was being taught in tango classes when I was in Argentina in 2005. I was training for the Buenos Aires Championships and then the World Championships. I looked at what was being taught, how the classes were being done, and then I looked at video footage of the World Championships. And I was like, what makes the winner different from the person who got second place? What makes the second place person different from the person who got third place? And I identified a couple of things. I was like, okay, the people who are getting first place are taking long steps. They're really good at turning 180 degrees and doing A, B, C, D, and E. None of those things are being taught in classes. Therefore, if I want to be good, if I want to improve as quickly as possible, I should focus on the things that they are doing but not teaching. So I do that everywhere. I look for that dislocation everywhere. Does that make sense? This is a very good question. So do I feel like I'm competing with Ramit Sethi? I really, really, really feel like you should focus on creating a new category, and as soon as you do that, you have no competition. And if you focus on your 1,000 true fans, you don't have to ever worry about that. And I know so many entrepreneurs who spend so much time, I mean, like literally, it's probably half of their time, 70% of their time, worrying about competition. I never worry about competition. Literally zero. I never, ever, ever worry. That's it. All right. Thank you, guys. Bye.